Education is a tricky thing. You never know what sticks. My theory, for what it's worth, is that education is a blend of knowledge of material, but also experiences. When I was a child who needed heroes. I admired Martin Luther King. One of my earliest Jewish memories was of watching Rabbi Bolka lead a large group of protesters in the freezing cold outside the Russian embassy in Ottawa in the late 60s. In 1974, my parents dragged me to a neighbor's to break my fast after Yom Kippur. My host had a very young lady speak about her husband, Anatoly, and his arrest in Russia and the need to assist him. These experiences helped mold my beliefs, and I was honored to meet Professor Cotler and his wife, as our family seemed to always end up on the same flights back and forth to Israel in the 70s. Canada supplied heroes to these fights of human rights. The tower among them is here tonight. Professor Cotler is a world-renowned expert and fighter for human rights. He is professor of law emeritus at McGill University and has been a visiting professor at Harvard and Yale and a recipient of 9 honorary doctorates. As well, he is a human rights lawyer who has litigated every section of the Canadian Charter of Human Rights and has represented Andrei Sakharov and Natan Sharansky, Nelson Mandela, and those at the forefront of human rights in Latin America, Asia, Russia, Nigeria, China, and Egypt. He is an MP representing Mount Royal, first elected in 1999, re-elected in 2000, 2004, 2006, 2008, and 2011. In December 2003, he was appointed Minister of Justice, a role he served till 2006. I give you tonight one of my role models in the fight for human rights, Irwin Cotler.
Thank you very much for those very kind words, Jonathan, and to my old and good friend Aviva. Where's Bruchim Abim to all of you. And speaking of role models, I just want to welcome David Azrieli and his family, because they have been role models not only in Canada but in Israel and elsewhere for the incredible and inspirational work that you've been doing on behalf of Israel and the Jewish people, indeed on behalf of humanity, and we all commend you for that. I also want to thank, along with Aviva, Deidre, and the organizers for putting together this wonderful conference, which I am delighted to be able to be a modest part of. May I preface my remarks this evening with a personal statement. In a word, speaking on the Holocaust is something, frankly, that I do with difficulty. For the subject matter evokes in me, and always has, a sense of awe and reverence, indeed humility. For I have neither the wisdom of the scholar nor the experience, the witness of the survivor. And so I address it always with a certain degree of hesitation and not without a certain measure of pain. I'm reminded only of what my parents taught me while I was still a young boy, the profundity and pain of which I realized only years later, that there are things in Jewish history, in human history, that are too terrible to be believed, but they're not too terrible to have happened. Oswiecim, Majdanek, Dachau, these are beyond vocabulary. Words may ease the pain, but they also dwarf the tragedy. For the Holocaust, as Professor Yehuda Bauer reminds us, is uniquely unique. Unique in its genocidal singularity, where biology was inescapably destiny. Whereas Elie Wiesel reminds us again and again, the Holocaust was a war against the Jews in which not all victims were Jews, but all Jews everywhere were targeted victims. Indeed, it now appears, as incredible as this may seem, that the full dimensions of this unprecedented evil, of these unfathomable horrors, are only now becoming fully known. For it has just been recently revealed by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, after 13 years of research, we now are finding the developing full extent of Nazi criminality, where they've revealed the existence now of some 42,500 documented ghettos, killing centers, forced labor camps, POW camps, and quote-unquote care centers, where babies were aborted and murdered. The sheer magnitude of this recent revelation has shocked even Holocaust experts. As it happens, this year's Holocaust Remembrance Day, Holocaust Remembrance Conference, coincides with important moments of remembrance and reminder, of witness and warning. It is the 80th anniversary of Hitler's ascent to power. You know, it's interesting. I saw very little about this being addressed anywhere or even being acknowledged. One of the few who spoke of it was Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, who said last January in a rather poignant warning that a few months after his ascent to power, in 1933, academics and students were already joining the Nazis in the burning of books. And so you have a sense already 80 years ago of the developing horrors that were to then malignantly morph into genocide and the Holocaust. The 70th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, recalling the heroic resistance of a starved, decimated Jewish remnant. You know, always when you're in Israel, and increasingly also now in the diaspora, it's not just Yom HaShoah. It's Yom HaShoah v'Gvura, so that we remember not only the horrors of the Holocaust, but the bravery, the dignity of the resistance. And indeed, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was the most noble act of resistance and most heroic act than any other single act resistance of its kind in the Second World War. Meeting also on the eve of the 65th anniversary of the Genocide Convention, the Never Again Convention, which we will commemorate on December 9th, 65 years later, and which has been violated tragically again and again. On the eve of the 65th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, sometimes spoken of as the Magna Carta of Human Rights, which, as former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan said, and I quote, emerged from the ashes of the Holocaust, intended to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, but where, as he reminded us, a UN that fails to be at the forefront of the fight against anti-Semitism and other forms of racism denies its history and undermines its future. And we meet also on the occasion, and this too is a historical moment, of Canada assuming the chair now of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And so on this anniversary of anniversaries, we must ask ourselves, what have we learned? And more importantly, what must we do? The first lesson, as I shared yesterday at the Holocaust Remembrance Commemorative Ceremony, largely with the survivors, the first lesson is the importance, I would say, the imperative of Zachor, of remembrance itself. For as we remember the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust, defamed, dehumanized, and demonized as prologue and justification for their mass murder, we have to understand that the mass murder of 6 million Jews and millions of non-Jews is not a matter of abstract statistics. For as we say in each gathering on Yom HaShoah. Unto each person there is a name. Each person is an identity. Each person is a universe, reminding us, as our sages would put it, Hametzil Adam Achad Kilu Itzil Olam Kulo. That if you save a single life, it is as if you have saved an entire universe. Just as if you kill a single person, it is as if you have killed an entire universe. And so the abiding imperative of this first lesson, that Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh, that we are each, wherever we are, the guarantors of each other's destiny. Which brings me now to a second lesson that also often goes unaddressed, and that is the right of memory. Simply put, one of the more compelling lessons of the Holocaust, and which is not yet enshrined as a human right, is the right to remember. Indeed, if Elie Wiesel can be said to have patented a human right, it is this right of remembrance, of memory. Once again, it is best to let Elie speak, lest any paraphrase lose in translation. And here his remarks on the right of memory, and I quote, "We have learned that human rights naturally include the right to be free, the right to be together, the right to live, but also must include the right to remember. Memory is one of the human rights to which we are all entitled. For the enemy was also against memory. Not only the enemy in Nazi Germany, but even, and as Elie put it, and I don't compare again, please remember, I never compare any regime to the Nazi regime, any criminal leader to Hitler or Eichmann." But then it goes on to say, "The Soviet totalitarian policy also tried to manipulate memory. 1 year Stalin occupied 50 pages, the next year only 1 page, the year after not even a word of praise. He was no longer a leader, but a criminal, or the other way around. A dictatorship feels that it has the right to adapt, to adjust, to mutilate memory. And we believe that every person has the human right to be remembered as he or she was," unquote. Indeed, as I said elsewhere, in recalling the forgotten exodus or the forced exodus of Jewish refugees from Arab countries, if there is no memory, there will be no truth. If there's no truth, there will be no justice. And if there's no justice, there will be neither the authentic reconciliation or the peace that we all seek. Which brings me to lesson 3, the danger of state-sanctioned ideologies of hate. The enduring lesson of the Holocaust of European Jewry is that it succeeded not only because of the industry of death and the technology of terror, but because of state-sanctioned ideologies of hate. It is this teaching of contempt, this demonizing of the other, this is where it all begins. As the Supreme Court of Canada put it in upholding the constitutionality of anti-hate legislation in the cause célèbres of 20-some years ago, a Keekstra case, etc. And as the court said, and I quote, "The Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers. It began with words," said the court. "These, as the court put it, are the chilling facts of history. These, as the court put it, are the catastrophic effects of racism." The whole reaffirms some weeks ago in somewhat lesser known but important unanimous judgment of the Canadian Supreme Court upholding the constitutionality of both our federal human rights and criminal anti-hate legislation. Moreover, we are witnessing yet again a state-sanctioned incitement to hate and genocide whose epicenter is Ahmadinejad's Iran. And I use that term to distinguish it from the people and publics of Iran who are otherwise the targets of mass domestic repression. As the unanimous report of the All-Party Standing Committee of Foreign Affairs of the Canadian Parliament put it, and I have to tell you, in our rather partisan, polarized Parliament, it's difficult to get a unanimous judgment of all parties on anything. But there is a unanimous judgment, an important finding of fact and conclusion of law by all parties of the Canadian Parliament, which said, and I quote, "Iran has already committed the crime of incitement to genocide prohibited by the Genocide Convention," and called on all state parties to the Genocide Convention to hold the Iranian government to account. Yet as we meet, I regret to say, and I know that I've said this before, but it bears repetition, as we meet, not one state party to the Genocide Convention, not Canada, not the United States, not any of the European countries, has undertaken any of its mandated legal remedies under the Genocide Convention and under international law to bring the Iranian leaders to justice for their violation of the prohibitions against incitement to genocide. Which brings me now, and almost as a corollary or consequence, to the fourth lesson, and that is the dangers of indifference and inaction. And this lesson is essentially that these Holocaust crimes resulted not only from the state-sanctioned incitement to hate and genocide, but from crimes of indifference, from conspiracies of silence, of the international community as bystander. As it happens, Holocaust Remembrance Day this year, which fell on April 7th under our Jewish calendar, fell on the exact same day as the remembrance of the Rwandan genocide, which fell also on April 7th this year. And where in the Rwandan genocide, from April to July 1994, more than 1 million Tutsis were murdered in that unspeakable genocide. I say unspeakable because, like the Holocaust, this genocide was preventable. Nobody could say that we did not know. We knew, but we did not act. Just with regard to this first genocide of the 21st century in Darfur, nobody could say that we did not know. We knew, but we did not act. And as we meet, and I'm not making comparisons, but only on dangers of indifference and inaction, we have yet to stop the slaughter of civilians in Syria. And as I say this, you know that the month of March, more Syrians and Syrian civilians were killed in March, 6,000, than in any other month since the killings began over 2 years ago. And it passed without even a footnote, almost in terms of the banality of atrocity, the whole ignoring the lessons of history and mocking the responsibility to protect doctrine. By the way, as I've always said, the responsibility to protect doctrine, which the UN Security Council adopted in 2005, has its origins, if you will, in terms of Jewish principle and law. Lo tamod al dam re'acha. You shall not stand idly by while thy brother's and sister's blood is being shed. And so let there be no mistake about it. Indifference and inaction always means coming down on the side of the victimizer, never on the side of the victim. Indifference in the face of evil is acquiescence with evil itself. Indeed, I would say it's complicity with evil itself. Lesson 5, la trahison des clercs, the betrayal by the intellectuals. Again, Nazism almost succeeded not only because of the bureaucratization of genocide, as Robert Lifton put it, but because of the trahison des clercs, the betrayal of the elites, as Julien Benda put it far back as 1938. Indeed, it is this trahison des clercs, this complicity of the elites, physicians, church leaders, judges, lawyers, engineers, architects, educators, and like, that nurtured the killing fields of the Nazis. Indeed, one only has to read Ingo Mueller's book on Hitler's justice to appreciate the complicity of lawyers and judges in the Third Reich. One only has to read Robert Proctor's work on racial hygiene and medicine under the Nazis to see the role that physicians played as gatekeepers and executioners in the death camps. One only has to look at Robert Jan van Pelt's book to see the role of engineers and architects in the design of the death camps. Holocaust crimes, then, were also the crimes of the Nuremberg elites. As Elie Wiesel put it, and I quote, "Cold-blooded murder and culture did not exclude each other. If the Holocaust proved anything, it is that a person can both love poems and kill children." And so it is our responsibility, wherever we are, to speak truth to power and to hold power accountable to truth. While those of us who've been entrusted with the education and training of the future elites should ensure, for example, that Elie Wiesel is studied in schools of law, not just in schools of literature or classes of literature. That the double entendre of Nuremberg, the Nuremberg of jackboots, the Nuremberg of racism, as well as the Nuremberg principles and the Nuremberg judgments, that this is part of our learning as it is part of our legacy. That Mueller's book, Hitler's Justice, underpins our perspective as it informs our principles on justice and injustice. In a word, the antidote to the trahison d'éclair in our time is for the writer, the artist, the journalist, the physician, the lawyer, the engineer, the architect, the educator, to also stand up and be counted, and not look around to see whoever else is standing before we make a judgment to do so. Because tragically, in the world in which we live, few people are prepared to stand up enough to evil, let alone to be counted. Lesson 6, Nuremberg, racism, and the Holocaust. The enduring question, which is often asked at academic conclaves or in ordinary conversation, that why the Holocaust? Why the Nazi genocide? Remaining the question that one hears oft today as well. I don't purport to have an answer to the why, but offer the following thought grounded in part in the work of Gordon Allport on racism and discrimination, that of Christopher Browning on the development of the Holocaust, and Daniel Goldhagen on the Nazis and the Jewish genocide. In a word, Nazism almost succeeded not only because of the reasons that I have mentioned thus far, the ideology of hate and the industry of death, not only because of the crimes of indifference and conspiracies of silence, not only because of the trahison d'éclair and the complicity of the elites, but because of an internalized legacy of racism and anti-Semitism over time, because of an ingrained culture of racism and anti-Semitism. Indeed, it is this culture of racism, this eliminationist anti-Semitism, as Daniel Goldhagen put it, anchored in the theory and practice of Nazi racial hygiene that transferred ordinary Germans into Hitler's willing executioners. And if the critique be made, as it is, that if this be true of Germans, is this not true of others? Why single out the Germans? And the answer must be that racism and anti-Semitism was not only German, but European. That ordinary men became willing executioners in the Baltics and the Balkans, in Vichy France and Quisling's Norway. That even Norway enacted Nuremberg race laws and deported its Jewish population to Auschwitz. And that the ugly legacy of racism is still with us. Let there be no mistake about it. Jews died at Auschwitz in the death camps because of anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism did not die and haunts us still. And so what must be realized, and as history has taught us only too well, and with regard to the Nazi Holocaust of the Jews, dramatizes this, that while it may begin with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. Indeed, that while it may begin with blacks or Asians or Muslims or Armenians, and today is the 98th anniversary of the Armenian genocide, which we commemorated in Parliament earlier today, or Roma, as victims of violations of human rights, it doesn't end with them. The struggle against racism of any kind must not therefore simply be seen as a Jewish issue or a black issue or an Asian issue or an ethnic issue of one racialized group or another, but as a profound justice issue of the first import. The familiar words, and I know these words are familiar such that they've almost become cliché-ish, but they bear reminder and recall. And that is the words of the German Protestant theologian Martin Niemöller, bear not only recall today, but more importantly, acting upon them beyond today. And I quote, "They first came for the Catholics, but I wasn't a Catholic, so I did nothing. They then came for the communists, but I wasn't a communist, so I did nothing. They then came for the trade unionists, but I wasn't a trade unionist, so I did nothing. They then came for the Jews, but I wasn't a Jew, so I did nothing. They then came for me, and there was nobody left." Which brings me now to the seventh lesson. The vulnerability of the powerless and the powerlessness of the vulnerable, which found expression in the triage of Nazi racial hygiene. The sterilization laws, the Nuremberg race laws, the euthanasia program, the whole targeting those, to use the Nazi words, those whose lives were not worth living. It is not unrevealing, though not always as well known as it should be, as Professor Henry Friedlander points out in his work on the origins of genocide, that the first group targeted for killing were the Jewish disabled. The whole anchored in the science of death, the Nazis' medicalization of ethnic cleansing, the sanitizing even of the vocabulary of destruction. And so it is our responsibility as citoyens du monde to give voice to the voiceless, to empower the powerless, be they the disabled, the poor, the elderly, the women victims of violence, or the vulnerable child, the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. Lesson 8, combating mass atrocity and the culture of impunity, the responsibility to bring war criminals to justice. If the last century, symbolized by the Holocaust, was the age of atrocity, it was also the age of impunity. Few of the perpetrators were brought to justice. And so, just as there must be no sanctuary for hate, no refuge for bigotry, so there must be no base or sanctuary for these enemies of humankind, these hostis humanus generis, as known in international law. One need not look any further than the case of Ahmed Haroun to get an appreciation of this culture of impunity. This Sudanese Minister of the Interior, indicted for his direct role in war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Darfur genocide, who was then cynically rewarded for this indictment by being appointed Minister of State for Humanitarian Affairs in Sudan, and made responsible for the hearing of human rights complaints from the very people who he had been responsible for killing. Unless that be said to have been 9 years ago, I can tell you that as we meet, this same Ahmed Haroun is repeating his war crimes and crimes against humanity now as the governor of South Kordofan, and where we are repeating this same culture of impunity as he and President al-Bashir of Sudan, indicted war criminals before the International Criminal Court, are nowhere to be found accountable. And if you need just another and last example of many that I can give, it's Ahmed Vahidi. As we meet, the minister responsible for quote-unquote arms control in Iran, but one of the people named by the Argentinian tribunal as being responsible for planning and perpetrating the largest terrorist atrocity in Argentina since the end of the Second World War, the bombing of the Amia, the Jewish Community Center, 85 murdered, more than 300 wounded. This same Ahmed Vahidi, who is really subject to an Interpol arrest warrant, now moves freely as well as a minister in the Iranian government. No more dramatic example of the culture of impunity can be found. Brings me, and I'm starting to move too close to lesson 9, women's rights. The Holocaust and the genocides since have included horrific crimes against women. Moreover, these crimes have not only attended the genocide or been in consequence of it, which would be bad enough, but they have in fact been in pursuit of it. Yet they remain the still unarticulated horror of the Holocaust and the genocide of European Jewry. Close to 75 years later, this lesson remains to be learned and acted upon, as we witness again and again sexual crimes of violence against women in armed conflict. The struggle for international women's rights, then, must be a priority on any justice agenda. The notion that women's rights are human rights, that there are no human rights without the rights of women, which was the clarion call 20 years ago when I attended then in Vienna the International Women's Rights Conference. That clarion call must now be a priority on every justice agenda as a matter of principle and policy. Would you like something to... Could I give you some juice just now? Okay. No, it's okay. Just, yeah. I'll take the water. Charlotte Bunch dramatically summed up this particular priority and principle in one pithy statement as follows, and I quote, "Significant numbers of the world's population are routinely subject to torture, starvation, terrorism, humiliation, mutilation, and even murder simply because they are female." Brings me to the 10th lesson, the rights of children. If there is an atrocity that belies understanding, it is the willful exploitation, maiming, and killing of a child, the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. What then has one to say about the genocide, the mass murder of children, the destruction of millions of universes, of generations yet unborn and never to be born? As the poet Bialik put it so well, writing after the Kishinev pogroms in 1903, which killed hundreds of children, and I quote, "There is no revenge that can be invented for the murder of a child." Indeed, the Nazi genocide, as we know only too well, was a genocide of millions of children, and 1.5 million children perished in the Holocaust of European Jewry. But we have yet to learn from this most horrific of horrors. We have this kind of dissonance in international human rights, where on the one hand, we speak of an explosion of international human rights law, including, among other things, the International Treaty for the Rights of Children. And yet, at the same time, we find that this treaty, which was ratified by more countries than any other international treaty, which is the good news, has been violated by more countries than any other international treaty. As a result, millions of children, statistics are simply numbing, find themselves in alarming situations where they are as much hostages as they are victims. And I won't bore or burden you with going through that, other than to just recount to you one of the most profound human rights lessons that I ever learned from my daughter, who taught me this when she was 15 years of age. She's now 33, and bears on this lesson when she said to me one day, "Daddy, if you want to know what the real test of human rights is, then always ask yourself, at any time, in any situation, in any part of the world, is it good for children? Is what is happening good for children? That's the real test of human rights, Daddy." Which brings me to lesson 11, and that is the increasing danger, yet again, of Holocaust denial, inversion, trivialization, and the like. I'll deal only with the for reasons of time, with that of Holocaust denial. The Holocaust denial movement, the cutting edge of anti-Semitism, old and new, is not just an assault on Jewish memory and human dignity in its accusation that the Holocaust is a hoax. Rather, it constitutes an international criminal conspiracy to cover up the worst crimes of history. Here's the historiography of the Holocaust in the most tragic, bitter irony, in its ultimate Orwellian inversion. First, we move from the genocide of the Jewish people to a denial that the genocide ever took place. Then, in a classic Orwellian cover-up of an international conspiracy, the Holocaust denial movement whitewashes the crimes of the Nazis as it excoriates the crimes of the Jews. It not only holds that the Holocaust was a hoax, but maligns the Jews for fabricating this hoax. And so it becomes our responsibility always to unmask the bearers of this false witness, to expose the criminality of the deniers as we protect the dignity of their Jewish victims. Lesson 12 is the imperative of remembering and commending the rescuers, the righteous among the nations, of whom Raoul Wallenberg is metaphor and message. The Swedish non-Jew, Canada's first honorary citizen, who saved more Jews in 5 months in Hungary in 1944 than any single government or organization. A staggering datum, but happens to be the case, and I mention him in terms of representing Chasidei Umot Ha'olam. And to conclude, we must always remember, always, whenever we meet in gatherings such as these, as I said in my concluding remarks yesterday in the House and in the conference, the survivors of the Holocaust. And so I address my closing words to the survivors amongst us, their families, and by extension for all of us who are, metaphorically speaking, survivors, but to those who survived those horrors. You are the true heroes of humanity. You witnessed and endured the worst of inhumanity, but somehow found in the depths of your own humanity the courage to go on, to rebuild your lives as you helped build the communities in which you live, as you helped build the country of Canada. And so together with you, we must remember and more. We must pledge that never again will we be indifferent to incitement and hate, that never again will we be silent in the face of evil, that never again will we indulge racism and anti-Semitism, that never again will we ignore the plight of the vulnerable, that never again will we be indifferent in the face of mass atrocity and impunity. But we will speak up and we will act against racism, against hate, against anti-Semitism, against mass atrocity, against injustice and impunity, against the crime of crimes whose name we should even shudder to mention, namely genocide, and always, always against being bystanders to justice. To close with the stirring words of the survivors, which resonate for me at all times, words which you know so well, which comes from their song, Zog nicht keinmal as de geest den letzten Weg. Never say that you are traveling the last road. Wir seien da. We are here. Thank you.
Professor Cotler, while you have once again shown us the power of your ideas and the power of your language, I find myself searching for ways to adequately thank you for what you've done for all of us this afternoon. Not only have you provided us a most important historical context for this conference about responsibility and memory after the Holocaust, not only have you shown a spotlight on recent revelations showing the greater extent of the Shoah than previously known, but your reflections on what we have learned and what we must do are all powerful calls both to memory and action. In the world that you've described of state-sanctioned ideologies of hate, faced with the dangers of inaction and indifference where accountability is absent in so many different ways, you, Professor Cotler, stand as a beacon of clarity of thought, a fearless advocate for justice that all Canadians can acknowledge and respect. May your ideas motivate all of us in this room and who will be watching this to greater action and to fuller remembrance. Thank you.